Her pulse became a visible, frantic rhythm beneath the translucent skin of her throat. It was not a battle response. It was not a tactical adrenaline surge. It was a complete biological surrender to the fact that someone had moved a piece of fabric. 11 minutes earlier, he was just a laundry worker with a cloth. And for 11 years before that, she had been entirely, perfectly alone. The library was cold, not a mechanical failure of the heating grid, and not the sharp chill of the high atmospheric drafts that sometimes leak through the upper palace seals. It was a deliberate, pride-kept cold. Warlord Lyra of the Itherani required the ambient temperature to remain precisely at the threshold of physical discomfort. It kept her focused on the endless streams of planetary governance. Certainly, it kept her awake during the grueling cycle of administrative briefings. Mostly, it kept her from remembering the warmth of a bonded mate who had been dead for exactly 4,015 days. No one had spoken a word of unstructured greeting to her in all that time. Her species possessed skin like frosted glass. It was an evolutionary trait designed to display the bioluminescent thrum of their cardiovascular system as a visual language of trust and emotion. Lyra kept hers hidden. She wore high, aggressively structured armored collars. She wore thick, woven mantles of deep indigo. She buried the glowing evidence of her biology beneath heavy velvet and the rigid expectations of her rank. On the great stone chair at the center of the vast archive, a single gray pillow sat untouched. It was cold and meaningless. The palace quartermaster had placed it there to support the lower spine during long reading sessions, a standard ergonomic protocol for the library's central dais. Lyra refused to lean back against it. Yielding to a simple cushion felt dangerously close to yielding to grief, to admitting that she possessed a body that could ache or require comfort. She sat rigidly forward instead, her posture a weapon, reviewing supply manifests that blurred together into a meaningless string of numbers. The massive chamber echoed only with the crisp turning of vellum pages and the distant, sterile marching of the perimeter guard stationed by the heavy oak doors. Emptiness was her chosen armor. She had cultivated this total isolation with the same ruthless military precision she once applied to orbital blockades. Junior advisors entered. It deposited their encrypted reports on the extreme edge of the obsidian table and retreated instantly without daring to make eye contact. The library functioned as her fortress within the palace, a place where the air grew stale and the towering shadows stretched undisturbed across the vaulted, painted ceiling. To speak to the warlord informally was to risk her legendary, devastating temper. To offer her any form of comfort or sympathy was to invite immediate reassignment to the penal colonies. So the palace staff gave her nothing. The great silence of the room settled deep into her bones. It slowly turned her own crystalline biology into something brittle, sharp, and unyielding. The cold was a safe harbor. It asked no difficult questions. It demanded absolutely no vulnerability from a leader who could not afford to show weakness. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the archive did not open with their usual ceremonial, booming groan. They slipped ajar with a quiet, practiced ease. A human stepped inside. He was not wearing the gold-threaded robes of a diplomatic dignitary, nor did he wear the polished, ceremonial armor of the royal guard. He wore the faded gray, slightly stained utilitarian tunic of the lower laundry echelons. A battered canvas cart trailed lazily behind him, its squeaking wheels meticulously wrapped in thick felt strips to mute their movement against the stone. His name was Elias. He was perhaps 30 standard years old, possessing the unassuming, slightly slouched build of a man who spent his entire life looking down at the floor, picking up the messes of a galaxy that didn't know his name. Why he should not have been here during her restricted study hours The palace schedule strictly legally prohibited maintenance staff from overlapping with the warlord's physical presence in any sector. Victor did not look at the raised dais. He did not drop to one knee in a display of terrified reverence. He simply parked his lopsided cart near a row of towering ancient bookshelves and began gathering the discarded reading blankets left behind by the night shift scholars. He was entirely invisible to the rigid hierarchy of the room. A visiting dignitary would have trembled upon crossing the threshold. A seasoned general would have immediately saluted and awaited recognition. Victor picked up a discarded woolen throw, inspected a dark stain on the hem with mild disappointment, and let out a soft, bone-deep sigh. "Smells like rain in here," he muttered to himself. He tossed the blanket into his cart. He didn't realize he had spoken aloud. He didn't realize the flawless acoustics of the grand library carried his low, gravelly voice straight to the center of the room, cutting through the silence like a dropped heavy tool. A laundry worker had no business noticing her cold chair. But he noticed. Lyra's armored hands froze over a planetary defense requisition form. Her dark eyes lifted, locking onto the intruder. She was about to summon the perimeter guard. She was about to have this oblivious, insignificant creature thrown into the lightless, lower detention levels for violating the sacred silence of the archive. Her personal tolerance for structural disobedience had always been absolute zero. She had ordered men court-martialed for clearing their throats during a briefing. The fact that she did not immediately signal the guards was a deviation she could not fully explain. Victor moved closer to the central dais. He wasn't approaching her with the frantic, nervous energy of an assassin or the obsequious bowing of a servant. He was just doing his job. Lyra sat perfectly, terrifyingly still, watching him through the narrow slit of her high collar. He stopped 3 paces away. He pulled a clean, impeccably folded microfiber cloth from his utility belt. He looked at the fine layer of dust accumulating on the carved armrests. He looked at the warlord, who was rigid as a marble statue, projecting enough focused, lethal intent to stop a charging apex predator in its tracks. Victor just blinked. He stepped forward. He wiped the left armrest in a smooth circular motion. He wiped the right armrest. Then, he looked at the gray pillow resting behind her back, the one she never leaned against, the one that sat slightly askew, neglected and cold. He reached out. His calloused, warm hand brushed the empty space just an inch behind her rigid shoulder. He adjusted the pillow, fluffing the dense material with 2 quick, efficient pats, and placed it perfectly center against the stone. He didn't ask permission. He didn't apologize for his proximity. He just cleaned her chair. The library went silent, not empty. The silence of 11 beings choosing not to breathe. The pillow made no sound as it settled against the stone. Neither did she, which meant the medical scanners were wrong. Lyra's internal biological monitors, the deep physiological pathways built exclusively for combat and extreme survival, completely and catastrophically collapsed. Her jaw locked. Her primary heart skipped a rhythm, stuttered against her ribs, and began to race with a frantic, terrifying speed. Beneath the thick velvet of her high collar, the translucent skin of her throat lit up. A bright, pulsing, bioluminescent blue began to bleed through the fabric. It was the Ithirani biological marker for sudden, overwhelming vulnerability. She couldn't move. Her military training dictated a swift physical strike to neutralize the proximity threat. Her royal pride demanded a verbal reprimand that would shatter the human's fragile eardrums. Instead, she remained entirely frozen, trapped helplessly in the quiet gravitational pull of a man casually folding a dustcloth. How long had she been sitting there? How long had she been forcing her spine to ache against the unforgiving stone? Her pretending she didn't need something as simple as a cushion? The ambient heat radiating from his hand, the residual human warmth left trapped in the fabric of the pillow just inches from her back, felt like a blinding solar flare detonating in the frozen wasteland of her existence. He hadn't flinched from her intimidating posture. He hadn't cowered under her murderous glare. He had looked at the most terrifying military commander in the sector and simply decided her chair looked a bit uncomfortable. She steadied herself. She forced her breathing to slow, demanding her biology obey her rank. The pulsing light at her throat only grew brighter. The calm she had manufactured over a decade entirely collapsed. She was an architect of planetary sieges, a veteran of the long dark campaigns in the Outer Rim, a leader who had negotiated treaties while bleeding from shrapnel wounds, never once letting her skin reveal a single flicker of pain to her enemies. Yet here, in the safest room on the planet, a gray-clad laborer with a dust cloth had undone 11 years of meticulous emotional fortification in roughly 6 seconds. She was terrified. She was also vaguely, inexplicably annoyed that a tiny smudge remained on the lower pedestal of the chair, though she couldn't tear her focus away from the sudden, rhythmic, pulsing heat in her own wrists. She found herself noting that the library's overhead chandelier had a single burnt-out bulb near the western archway. It was a minor maintenance failure. She stared at that dull, unlit crystal for a very long time, grasping at it, or trying desperately to ignore the way her chest was seizing and her armor was suddenly suffocating her. The space between them hummed. It was not a mechanical vibration from the palace's deep core generators, nor was it the atmospheric pressure stabilizers kicking in. It was the sudden, dense gravity of a closed circuit finally opening for the first time in a decade. At the extreme edge of the vast chamber, the captain of the guard moved his hand to his weapon. Well, he twitched his fingers toward his holstered sidearm, which at the time felt like the loudest movement in the room. He had seen the faint pulse of blue light reflecting off the underside of the Warlord's dark collar. He had seen her completely, uncharacteristically freeze. He did not know what the lowly human had done, but he knew exactly what it meant when an Ithirani stopped hiding the physical evidence of their biology. It meant the walls had come down. The perimeter guards exchanged a long, wide-eyed glance that contained more genuine terror than a planetary border skirmish. If the Warlord was vulnerable, the entire room was in uncharted, highly dangerous territory. Victor finished folding his cloth. He tucked it neatly back into the loop on his belt. He didn't seem to notice the statuesque, horrified stillness of the heavily armed alien soldiers surrounding the room. He didn't notice the Warlord staring at him with wide, completely unblinking eyes, her armor feeling suddenly too heavy for her frame. He just picked up the worn handle of his canvas cart. "Have a good one." He offered a small, polite, entirely informal nod to the room in general, and the wheels of his cart began their soft, felt-muffled rotation across the stone floor as he turned and walked away. He left the quiet library exactly as he found it, except for the pillow, which now held the undeniable, impossible ghost of his warmth. If you want to hear how this quiet moment changes everything, consider subscribing to the channel. We explore these stories every day. The cart's wheels squeaked against the corridor stones. Then the sound turned a corner. Then it vanished entirely. Gone. Still. Every single second stretched. Lyra remained locked in her rigid, upright posture at the center of the vast obsidian table. The silence inside the archive crashed back into the space, but it no longer functioned as her armor. It felt like a vacuum. Her biology was rushing in, frantic and uncontained, or to fill the sudden absence of the human. Beneath the thick, crushing velvet of her armored collar, The translucent frosted glass texture of her skin was an absolute disaster. She was glowing. The bright, pulsing, bioluminescent blue of extreme involuntary vulnerability bled through the dark fabric of her clothing. Her primary hearts hammered against her sternum in a chaotic, unsynchronized rhythm. As a scholar of Ithirani physiology, she attempted to categorize this data. She tried to frame the intense, localized heat pooling at the base of her spine as a simple thermal transfer, an anomaly of thermodynamics. It wasn't. She prepared to order the perimeter guards to execute a standard containment protocol on the corridor when she realized her jaw was trembling. The vast, echoing architecture of the Ithirani archive was designed to make its occupants feel small, to remind them of their insignificance against the weight of history. Lyra had always drawn strength from that crushing scale. Now it just felt empty. The pulse visible through her neck accelerated. It thrummed with a terrifying, undeniable knowledge that someone had seen her discomfort and simply removed it. The guards stationed at the heavy oak doors stood like petrified statues. They did not look at her. To acknowledge the warlord's biological breakdown was treason. They stared straight ahead, entirely silent, while the most feared military commander in the sector slowly, agonizingly realized she was coming apart at the seams. 2 standard hours passed. The perimeter guards had not relaxed their shoulders. Lyra had not moved a single centimeter forward or backward. Her internal biological monitors, which she had aggressively recalibrated by hand because the standard royal medical thresholds were entirely inadequate for a military commander of her specific operational background, suddenly registered a catastrophic, unexplainable drop in her baseline defensive cortisol levels. She was waiting. The heavy oak doors did not boom open with ceremonial weight. They clicked softly. Victor walked back into the archive. He did not have his canvas laundry cart. He held a chipped, heavily insulated ceramic cup from the lower maintenance galley. It was the kind of cheap, mass-produced vessel used by soil engineers and waste reclamation crews. A thin, curling ribbon of steam rose from the lid. The scent of the liquid hit the air. It wasn't the refined, a delicate aroma of the pale flora brewed in the high courts. It smelled like roasted root starch and burnt sugar. It smelled entirely, unapologetically terrestrial. He walked directly to the central dais. He completely bypassed 3 invisible rings of lethal security protocols just by slouching slightly and keeping his eyes fixed on the stone floor. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. Her bioluminescence flared so brightly that the vellum pages of her planetary defense reports caught the blue reflection. Victor stopped at the edge of the obsidian table. He set the cup down right next to an encrypted casualty projection. He slid a tiny dented tin warming candle beneath the ceramic base to keep the metal hot. He didn't bow. He didn't offer a traditional submission gesture. He looked up, meeting the wide, glowing, or terrified eyes of an alien who had forgotten how to receive kindness. "It's just tea, nothing else." He turned around. He walked out. It wasn't just the words. It was the way he said them, like they cost nothing. Like he had not just handed a lifeline to a creature drowning in an 11-year ocean of absolute, punishing cold. The physical devastation of that single mundane sentence ripped through her remaining psychological armor. She stopped correcting her posture. She stopped analyzing the tactical variables of the room, the forbidden fruit of this interaction, the impossible reality that a lowly cleaner had bypassed her entire terrifying reputation to offer her a hot drink, became undeniable. Her hand trembled as she reached out. She viewed the gesture initially as an anomaly. In her defense, comfort had been weaponized against her before by political rivals. She stopped treating it like a threat when her fingers brushed the warm ceramic. The shift was permanent. For 11 unbroken years, Warlord Lyra had sat perfectly upright. She had carried the agonizing weight of the Ithirani sector on an unsupported spine, refusing to yield to the physical limitations of her own body. She took a slow, jagged breath, and she leaned back, the gray pillow compressed behind her. It caught her weight. It held her. The residual heat from the human's hand was gone, but the structural permission to rest remained locked in the fabric. The stiff, armored plates of her high collar shifted, grating slightly against the stone as she changed her angle of inclination. It was a sound the room had not heard in over a decade. The physical surrender cascaded down her spine, unlocking vertebrae that had been fused by sheer stubborn willpower. She closed her eyes. Her translucent skin, which had been flashing with panicked, erratic blue pulses, slowly began to steady. The frantic light smoothed out into a soft, continuous, rhythmic glow. It was the biological equivalent of a heavy siege weapon finally powering down. She picked up the cup. She took a sip. The tea was incredibly bitter. It was poorly steeped and tasted faintly of industrial solvent and recycled water. It was the greatest thing she had ever consumed. The candle he left burning was given a name, a guard detail, and a small budget. That bureaucratic absurdity would happen the following week, when the palace quartermaster frantically tried to categorize the sudden, well, not permanent presence of a maintenance item on the warlord's official desk. But in this exact moment, the absurdity was entirely internal. Her entire physiology was undergoing a fundamental structural collapse. She noticed a microscopic, irrelevant scratch on the surface of the obsidian table. She stared at that tiny scratch for an exceptionally long time, focusing on it because the alternative was weeping. So the human just walked away, and she was left sitting there, and nobody in the entire heavily armed archive dared to exhale. Warmth spread through her chest. It bypassed her armored collar entirely. The pride that had kept her frozen and isolated dissolved into a terrifying, beautiful vulnerability. She did not raise her shields. It happened every day now. The routine settled deep into the ancient stone of the library. At 1400 hours, the cart squeaked. Victor arrived. He wiped the carved armrests. He adjusted the gray pillow. He placed a new cup of terrible, life-saving tea on the desk. He never stayed longer than 40 seconds. He never asked for a promotion or better quarters or even a single word of acknowledgement. He was just doing his job. But the archive was irrevocably changed. The perimeter guards no longer twitched toward their holstered sidearms when the wooden doors clicked open. The cold temperature of the room was still strictly maintained, but it wasn't a punishment anymore. Lyra waited for him. She worked through her morning administrative briefings with a strange, quiet efficiency. Her bioluminescence, once a tightly guarded military secret, now functioned as a glowing metronome counting down the seconds until 1400 hours. She never announced his arrival. She never spoke a single word to him. It wasn't a choice anymore. The connection existed, silent and massive, rooted entirely in the few inches of space between a human laborer and an alien sovereign. The gray pillow was no longer a neglected piece of royal ergonomic protocol. It was the absolute center of her physical world. She leaned into it the exact moment she sat down, wrapping her dark velvet mantle around it, letting the soft material press securely against her spine. Warmth wasn't pride's enemy anymore. It was home. The chipped ceramic cup sat empty on the edge of the great obsidian table, a single thin wisp of steam rising slowly toward the vaulted ceiling. Join us tomorrow for another story from the edge of the quiet universe.